96%. That is the share of Russia's March 2026 casualties Ukraine attributes to drones. 33,900 men out of a monthly total near 35,400, repeated by Britain's Defense Secretary in Berlin on the 15th of April. Now put ground under it. A tree line inside the 15-kilometer contested band. Above it, a Mavic quadcopter has watched one dugout entrance for hours. Kilometers back, a crew launches a 7-inch first-person view drone carrying a rocket-propelled grenade warhead worth about $350. Then, minutes later, the part almost nobody films. The reconnaissance drone goes back to look. No Ukrainian operator is on record describing one trench strike that follows him home. What the record holds is stranger. It says the moment that stops an operator is usually not the kill at all. Start with the ground, because the ground is what changed. A trench works by being a hole. For a century, that was enough. Artillery arrives on a ballistic arc, the fragments travel outward and upward, and a man below the lip of the earth is statistically very hard to kill. Every field manual written between 1916 and about 2022 rests on that arithmetic. Dig and you survive. The hole is the answer. The hole stopped being the answer when the munition learned to look down and steer. The Royal United Services Institute, in an insights paper published on the 23rd of October 2025, describes the geometry that replaced it. The contested zone along the line of contact now runs roughly 15 kilometers across, about 9 miles, and beyond its far boundary, the middle battle area extends a further 30 kilometers or so. Measured from the forward edge, that is something near 45 kilometers, call it 28 miles of ground under observation. Inside that band, small uncrewed aircraft see and strike more or less continuously. The band is best understood as a volume of contested air with a fixed floor under it. Every road, every track, every tree line, and every dugout inside that volume sits at a known address and stays at that known address until somebody physically moves it. If the mechanics of this war are what you came for, subscribing keeps these explainers in front of you as they are published. Back to the ground. That single change cascades into everything a soldier needs to stay alive. Resupply is the first casualty. Drones hunt the supply roads behind the contact zone as a matter of routine, so ammunition, water, and batteries stop arriving by vehicle in daylight and start arriving by whatever can cross 15 kilometers unseen. Medical support has moved back with them. The same RUSI assessment puts casualty evacuation increasingly 7 kilometers or more behind forward positions, conducted at night, and increasingly by uncrewed ground vehicles rather than by men carrying a stretcher. Remember that 7-kilometer figure. It is the number this episode keeps returning to, because it is the distance between a wounded man and any help at all, and nothing in the rest of the story shortens it. Rotation is the second casualty. Watling describes this as a deliberate method, one that Ukraine applies to Russian rotations by design. The aim is to place the enemy in a position where a successful rotation consumes as much resource as it replaces. Both sides are inside the same geometry, so the logic runs in both directions. Relieving a position means crossing the contested zone twice, once in and once out, with the drones watching both directions. So units stay in longer than they should, in holes that no longer protect them, further from evacuation than any army has accepted since the introduction of the field ambulance. The thing doing all of this costs about the same as a laptop. Ukrainian first-person view drones are costed at roughly $300 to $400 per airframe across defense industry reporting through 2025 and 2026, including Forbes coverage of Ukraine's shift to non-Chinese components. 7 to 10 inches across the props, a battery, a camera, a video transmitter, and whatever explosive the workshop had that week. Against that, the figure from the cold open. Britain's Defense Secretary John Healey told the Ukraine Defense Contact Group on the 15th of April 2026 that drones caused 33,900 Russian casualties in March of that year. That figure works out at around 96% of a monthly total near 35,400. President Zelensky had given the same breakdown 2 weeks earlier. That is a Ukrainian-sourced figure relayed by a Western defense minister rather than an independently audited count, and the share moves month to month. Other estimates are lower. Alexei Melnik of Ukraine's own Razumkov Centre, a former defense ministry official, puts the drone contribution nearer 70 to 80%. The exact number is disputed. The order of magnitude holds across all of these estimates, including the lowest one on the record. Here is the part that matters for this episode, and it is the part the casualty statistics cannot express. Artillery is blind to its own effect. A gunner 9 kilometers away pulls a lanyard and receives at best a grid correction over the radio. Every army since the 1800s has been built on that gap, on the fact that the man who fires and the man who falls do not share a moment. A first-person view drone closes that gap completely, and it closes it in the most literal way available. The operator is looking through the nose of the weapon on a live feed for the whole of the final approach. In August of 2024, a drone crew from the 13th Kartia Brigade, operating in the Kharkiv sector, found a wounded Russian soldier who had been left behind by his own unit. They did not strike him. They flew alongside him and led him toward Ukrainian positions until somebody could take him. The account comes from the Ukrainian side, and no independent body has verified it, which is worth saying before drawing anything from it. Hold that against the 7 kilometers. A wounded man in a forward position is saved or lost by whether anything crosses the ground to reach him and by what is watching that ground while it tries. Medicine is the last step in that sequence, and usually the least decisive one. In that case, the thing watching the ground was also the thing that could have killed him, and the decision sat with whoever was holding the sticks. Which raises the question this episode exists to answer. When the weapon can see, in the final seconds, exactly what it is about to hit, and when what it is about to hit turns out to be a man who has stopped fighting, what happens next? The question here is a legal and procedural one before it is ever a moral one. What is the operator required to do? What is he able to do? And what does the public record actually show him doing? To answer that, you have to understand what an anti-personnel drone strike physically is, because almost every popular account of it is wrong in the same way. It is a small industrial process, at least 2 aircraft, 2 or 3 people, and a chain of decisions that runs through all of them. Start with the eyes. The first aircraft into the sequence carries no warhead at all. It is a reconnaissance quadcopter, typically a Mavic-class commercial airframe, frequently the thermal variant, modified for encrypted transmission and flown high enough to loiter. Its job is surveillance, artillery correction, and battle damage assessment. It watches a tree line for hours and builds a pattern, which entrance is used when the sentry changes, where the exhaust from a stove stains the snow. Australian Army and West Point analyses of the war describe this as a sensor-to-shooter chain, and the shape of it is detection, confirmation, strike, then assessment. The confirmation step is the one that matters later, so hold on to it. What passes between the 2 crews is the part that never appears in the footage, and it is the hinge of the whole system. The reconnaissance crew hands over a picture, and that picture carries far more than a grid reference. They pass where the entrance sits relative to a fixed landmark the strike pilot can find at speed, and which direction the approach has to come from to stay out of the position's line of sight. They pass what the wind is doing in the last 100 meters. Critically, they also pass what they believe is inside. The strike pilot will see almost none of that himself. His camera is fixed forward on a fast-moving airframe with no zoom and no gimbal, and by the time the target is large enough to interpret, he is committed. So the strike crew is flying on somebody else's assessment, made minutes earlier, from a different altitude through a different lens. Every judgment about who is in that position and what they are doing was formed by the crew that is not flying the weapon. That division of labor is efficient, and it is also the reason the second look matters so much. The people who decide are structurally separated from the people who can see clearly, right up until the last seconds, when the roles abruptly swap. Then the strike aircraft. A first-person view drone is a racing airframe wearing a warhead, 7 to 10 inches across, brushless motors, a camera bolted rigidly to the frame, and an analog or digital video linked back to a pair of goggles. It has no autopilot in any meaningful sense, no terminal guidance package, no seeker head. The guidance system is a human being. Every correction in the last kilometer is a thumb on a stick. That is why these aircraft can do things no cruise missile can do: fly along a road at head height, turn 90 degrees into a doorway, and stop dead in the entrance. The warhead is where the engineering gets specific and where a lot of reporting gets lazy. There is no purpose-built anti-personnel FPV warhead in mass Ukrainian service. What crews work from instead is a scavenging menu assembled out of whatever the existing stockpiles already hold. The most common option is a rocket-propelled grenade round, the PG-7VL or VM family, separated from its rocket motor and fixed to the nose. The VL carries a 93mm warhead credited with defeating around 500mm of armor. That is a shaped charge, and a shaped charge is a very particular thing. Behind the conical liner, detonation collapses a copper cone into a thin jet moving at several kilometers per second. This is the Monroe effect, and it exists to punch a narrow hole through armor plate. Against a vehicle, it defeats the armor outright. Against earth and timber, it is close to useless, because a jet designed to defeat half a meter of steel simply drills a neat tunnel through a meter of soil and stops. Which is exactly why the other option exists. The TBG-7V is a thermobaric round from the same weapon family. It disperses a fuel cloud and then ignites it, producing a long-duration pressure wave rather than a short, focused jet, in open air that is unimpressive relative to a fragmentation shell. Inside a confined volume, a dugout, a bunker, the sealed end of a communication trench, the pressure wave reflects off the walls, reinforces itself, and fills the space. The physics that makes a hole a shelter against artillery is the same physics that makes it lethal against overpressure. The trench inverted from protection to trap, not because the drone got smarter, but because the munition changed from a directional jet to a volume-filling pressure event. One round type swapped for another did the whole of that work. There is a plainer way to say it. Artillery is a hammer swung at the field, and a shaped charge is a nail punched at a plate. A thermobaric round released inside a dugout behaves like water poured into a bottle. It goes wherever the space goes, and the space is the entire point of the weapon. Then there is the link. And the link is the reason this war looks different in 2026 than it did in 2023. An ordinary FPV drone flies on radio. Radio can be jammed, and both sides invested enormously in jamming, which for a period made the low approach unreliable. The answer was to remove the radio entirely. A fiber optic drone trails a spool of glass filament that carries video and control down a physical wire. Defense reporting through 2025 put the Ukrainian workhorse at a 10-kilometer spool. 20-kilometer spools are now fielded, and both sides have tested considerably longer variants, with one Ukrainian extended range model reported at around 40. There is nothing to jam and nothing to direction find, so the aircraft can fly low, slow, and inside clutter. Down a tree line, under a canopy, through a doorway. It never needs line of sight to a control antenna, which is precisely the thing a radio drone could never manage. The trade is a fragile tether and a one-way trip. Now assemble the whole sequence, because the sequence is what produces the moment this episode is about. The reconnaissance drone has been watching a position for hours and has a pattern. The crew launches the strike aircraft, which climbs, transits, and descends into the approach. The Overwatch drone stays high and keeps the wider picture. At some point in the final approach, the camera crosses a resolution threshold. The shape on the screen stops being a thermal blob and becomes a person, with a posture, a direction of gaze, and hands. That detail carries the whole of the argument that follows. The entire legal question later in this video turns on what a camera can resolve, and on nothing more sophisticated than that. The operator flies to impact, because he is the guidance. There is no other way. Nothing in the history of weapons has combined those two properties before. Distance and legibility usually trade against one another. A rifleman is close and sees clearly. An artilleryman is distant and sees nothing. Air-launched precision weapons put a camera in the loop, but the operator sits at a console with a target designated as a set of coordinates and a thermal signature at low resolution. The release decision was taken by somebody else, minutes earlier, on the basis of a target list. The FPV crew is at the artilleryman's distance with better than the rifleman's view, and the decision is theirs, in real time, in the last 2 seconds. Two more mechanical facts complete the picture, and both are load-bearing later. First, tempo. Analysis of Ukrainian drone team practice published by European defense researchers describes crews flying on the order of 10 or 15 missions a day. That is an estimate rather than an audited figure, and the real number swings with how many airframes the unit has that week. One crew commander has claimed as many as 40 strikes in a day. Whatever a single engagement does or does not do to the person flying it, it is an ordinary and repeated event in his week. Second, reliability. There is no agreed figure for how often an FPV sortie actually reaches its target, and anyone quoting a single clean percentage should be treated with suspicion. One set of published claims puts failure rates at 60 to 80% against armored targets. Another has success rising from around 30% in 2022 to around 70% by 2024. Individual operator accounts put mission success between 20 and 43%, depending on how you define success. These are not reconcilable, and most trace back to one side's reporting rather than to independent audit. The honest statement is that most sorties do not achieve what they were launched to achieve, which is itself the reason the Overwatch drone goes back to look. And that return trip is the whole problem. The confirmation step, the battle damage assessment, is the moment the crew finds out what is actually left in the position. Sometimes what is left is a man who is no longer fighting. That second flight, not the strike, is where this job gets hard. One documented case carries most of the argument, so start there. In April of 2025, Ukrainian military media reported an engagement by a crew of the 31st Separate Mechanized Brigade near Novosilka in Donetsk Oblast. The crew struck a Russian position. Then, following the ordinary sequence, they went back to assess what they had achieved. What the camera found was a surviving soldier, wounded, no longer fighting, looking up at the aircraft and signaling with his hands. The crew did not strike again. They used the drone to lead him toward Ukrainian lines, and he was taken. As with everything in this section, that is a Ukrainian account of Ukrainian conduct, published by the side that carried it out, and no independent body has confirmed it. Notice what actually decided the outcome. The weapon had already been expended, and no published rule covers the situation the crew found itself in. The outcome turned on the fact that somebody flew a second time and looked, and then correctly read a posture on a screen. So what does the job do to the person doing it? The honest answer is that nobody has measured it. United States Air Force research on Reaper and Predator crews, run by Wayne Chappell and colleagues, found clinical post-traumatic stress rates between under 1% and about 6% at or below manned aircrew. The strongest predictors were shift length and workload rather than the strike work itself. That research does not transfer. A Reaper crew works from a ground control station at continental distance inside a formal approval chain with lawyers in it. A Ukrainian first-person view crew sits inside the contested band, watches a camera close enough to read posture, and makes the call itself. No peer-reviewed Ukraine-specific study of these crews with a hard figure exists, and the Pentagon assessment ordered by the 2026 United States Defense Authorization Act is scoped to long-range operators rather than to this. Anyone quoting you a percentage for Ukrainian drone crews is quoting something that has not been produced. What the published interviews carry instead is something quieter, and it runs squarely against the version of this story most people arrive expecting. A feature published on the 21st of July 2026 carries an extended interview with a serving Ukrainian first-person view operator. Asked to compare killing through a screen with killing at rifle range, he answers in sensory terms and leaves the moral frame entirely alone. He is hovering 6 kilometers away, and the things that would reach a rifleman standing close simply do not reach him. What he is describing is a difference in working conditions. That answer is broadly typical. Across the published interviews, experienced operators tend toward the same stoicism. The work is framed as defensive necessity, the tempo as a job, and sleep as something they still get. The pattern holds across enough outlets to be treated as a finding rather than as evasion, with the standing caveat that soldiers speaking to journalists in wartime are neither a random sample nor an unconstrained one. Which brings the episode to its actual subject, the part that everything so far has been building toward. The strike is the mechanical half of the job. It is flown on somebody else's assessment at speed, with the target legible only in the final seconds. The half that requires a person is the one that comes afterward, when the reconnaissance drone goes back and the camera settles on someone who is alive and has stopped fighting. That crew is now looking at a man 7 kilometers or more from the nearest medical point, holding a weapon they cannot unlaunch in a picture they cannot unsee. They have to make a determination that international humanitarian law is extremely clear about and extremely unhelpful about at the same time. The law itself states the definition plainly. It sits in Article 41 of Additional Protocol 1, restated as Rule 47 of the International Committee of the Red Cross Study of Customary Humanitarian Law. The term is hors de combat, out of the fight. It covers 3 conditions. A person is in the power of an adverse party. A person clearly expresses an intention to surrender, or a person is unconscious or otherwise incapacitated, and therefore incapable of defending themselves. The protection carries a condition. The person must abstain from any hostile act and must not be attempting to escape. Meet it, and attacking them is prohibited outright. This is a rule of distinction, not a balancing test, so no proportionality calculation applies to it at all. Article 12 of the First Geneva Convention sits alongside it with the broader obligation that the wounded and sick be respected, protected, and treated humanely. The difficulty lies past the rule. Every mechanism it assumes for recognizing surrender was designed for 2 human beings who can see each other. Surrender in the classical form is a transaction. Weapons go down, hands go up, and somebody comes and takes custody. The surrendering soldier is safe because he has entered the physical power of the other side. A drone cannot take custody of anything because it has no hands. Escorting, disarming, feeding a prisoner, and bandaging him all sit outside what the machine can do. In the case of a strike drone, there is exactly one thing it can do to a human being. This is where the most useful document on the subject comes in, and it is worth naming precisely. On the 8th of February 2023, William Casey Biggerstaff and Caitlin Chiaramonte published an analysis through the Lieber Institute at West Point in its Articles of War series on the legal and practical challenges of surrendering to drones. Their argument runs roughly as follows. Surrender must be unambiguous, and the classically accepted signs, hands raised, weapon discarded, standing still, no attempt to move toward cover, translate perfectly well to a camera, provided the operator can see them. The operator can signal that he is understood by maneuvering the aircraft, climbing and descending, circling, or by loudspeaker where one is fitted. And at that point, they argue, the drone crew exercises something like constructive control over the surrendering soldier. That is control in effect, without ever physically holding him. They compare it in principle to a lone soldier who cannot escort a group of prisoners and instead directs them toward a rendezvous point. They also identify the edge that has no clean answer. If the platform overhead has no capacity to convey or receive any signal at all, his surrender is not yet legally complete, and stays incomplete until he actually reaches ground forces who can take him, which means his safety depends on a technical property of the aircraft looking at him, and on whether the crew flying it chose to look twice. Does any Ukrainian unit have a written standing order for this? On the public record, no. That is a genuine gap in the record, and it is being stated here as one. No institutional source, no Defense Ministry publication, and no on-record commander statement sets out what a first-person view operator is instructed to do when the feed shows a target who is clearly out of the fight. What exists instead is footage released by units of what they did. The Novosilka case sits inside a wider pattern of documented instances. In July of 2025, Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade reported what it described as a first. A group of Russian soldiers surrendered to unmanned systems alone, with no infantry crossing to collect them, and were guided across open ground to Ukrainian lines by drones. The practice is older than that. Back in June of 2023, near Bakhmut, a K-2 battalion crew used a drone to drop water and a written note to a Russian soldier, then let him out. In March of 2026, Ukraine's Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov claimed more than 100 Russians had been brought in this way over the preceding winter, a claim no independent body has audited. Look at what those accounts have in common. In every one, the decisive act is the second flight, and the decisive faculty is recognition. The strike is mechanical. The recognition is a human judgment, made in a few seconds by whoever is holding the sticks. Pull the thread back through the whole thing, because the shape of it cuts against the way the subject is usually handled. For most of the industrial era, the direction of weapons development was toward distance, and the ethical argument about remote warfare, at least since the 1990s, assumed that distance and detachment travel together. The first-person view drone breaks that assumption. It did not make killing more distant. It made it more legible. The operator is further from the target than a rifleman has ever been, and sees more of the target than a rifleman ever has. Those two facts arrive together in a $300 airframe, assembled by people solving a completely different problem. Three things follow, and two of them have moved since the legal analysis this episode leaned on was written. The first is that the acknowledgement problem is being solved with hardware, quietly, and it is units doing the solving while the lawyers are still writing. The Lieber analysis of 2023 treated a drone's ability to signal back as a limitation to be worked around. It is now a payload. In August of 2024, Defense Reporting documented Ukrainian crews flying a mattress-class quadcopter fitted with a loudspeaker, broadcasting instructions to Russian soldiers to raise their hands and follow the aircraft. Ukrainian military media has since reported a unit forcing 4 Russians to surrender by loudspeaker broadcast alone. Leaflets dropped by drone reportedly now carry a scannable code pointing to Ukraine's I Want to Live surrender channel, a government-run hotline that arranges the act in advance. The improvised answer to a legal gap became equipment, and it happened in under 2 years. The second is that the law has kept moving too, and in a direction that complicates the optimistic reading. In January of 2023, David Wallace and Shane Reeves argued through the same Liber series that a soldier who arranges surrender remotely through an app or a hotline is not yet out of the fight. Protection attaches only when he performs the physical act, drops the weapon, raises the hands, follows the drone. Wallace, Reeves, and Christopher Hart then set out a 3-part test in the Chicago Journal of International Law. It asks whether an attempted surrender is genuine, whether it is clear and unconditional, and whether accepting it is feasible for the force receiving it. Feasibility is the word that matters. It makes the capacity to safely accept a surrender into a legal question, binding on the force that receives it. The International Committee of the Red Cross has since gone further in its work on autonomous systems. It warns that a machine may simply be unable to reliably recognize signs of surrender because those signs are contextual and cannot be reduced to a target profile. The human in the loop is currently the thing making the rule work. The third is the one this episode was actually about, and it has not moved at all. Recognition is a technical capability. Whether a soldier who has stopped fighting is treated as out of the fight now depends on camera resolution, and on whether the aircraft can climb and descend to signal. It depends on whether a crew chose to send the second flight at all, and it depends on a body of law written for 2 people standing in a field. One honest gap in this account belongs on the record here. Everything documented in this video is Ukrainian. Ukraine publishes this material, has built an institutional channel for it, and benefits from publishing it. No comparable body of Russian reporting on drone-mediated capture of Ukrainian soldiers could be found, and the absence of published accounts is not evidence that the practice does not occur, nor that it does. United Nations investigators have made findings about Russian drone strikes on civilians in Kherson, and Ukrainian prosecutors have opened cases over the alleged shooting of surrendering Ukrainian soldiers near Avdiivka. Neither of those addresses the specific question of a drone crew striking someone in the act of giving up. On that, on both sides, the record is silent, and silence in a war is rarely neutral. So, the closing point. The hard part of this job is the second flight, the one that goes back to look. That is where the camera settles on a man who is no longer fighting. The decision then belongs to a person in a dugout on the other side of the contested band, with a few seconds of battery and no manual for it. That decision is made many times a week by both sides, and almost none of it is written down anywhere. Next time, the aircraft that makes the second flight possible in the first place, the reconnaissance quadcopter that carries no weapon, and how a $2,000 commercial camera drone ended up as the most consequential machine on the front.